The crystal chandeliers hanging in the grand ballroom probably cost more than my first car. I sat at table number 1 at the annual Chamber of Commerce Gala, an island of muted navy blue in a sea of my family's glittering designer clothes. For 10 years, I had been the silent architect of their success, the one who turned impending bankruptcy into award-winning profits, as my mother, Margaret, and brother, Leo, posed for the cameras. A master spreadsheet was running in my head, calculating the cost of the very banquet our company was sponsoring. I knew, down to the dollar, how much of my own life had paid for the stage they were about to use to erase me from my own story. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Eleanor, and for 10 years, the first and most persistent lie they told about me was that I was happy in the background, before the hum of polite chatter and the clinking of champagne glasses. There was the profound quiet of my own apartment. It was a simple space, neat and functional, filled with secondhand books on structural engineering and architectural history, relics of a dream I had carefully packed away. That evening, I stood before my closet, my hand brushing past the few sensible dresses I owned before landing on the familiar, textured wool of my navy blue blazer. It was 10 years old, bought for my first major client presentation, the one that single-handedly pulled Harris Construction back from the brink of oblivion. The blazer was a well-made garment, a quiet testament to endurance and quality, which was more than I could say for the loyalty of the people I had saved. Looking at my reflection, I saw a woman with tired eyes, her hair pulled back in a severe, efficient bun. I looked less like an executive and more like a librarian of secrets, the keeper of my family's carefully curated fiction. The drive to the hotel was a journey through a city that was, in many ways, my own secret portfolio. I passed the Riverwalk development, with its elegant cantilevered viewing platforms I had sketched on a napkin at 3 in the morning, after realizing the city's initial proposal was structurally unsound. I saw the gleam of the new public library, a project everyone said was impossible to win, secured through a bid I had spent 4 sleepless months perfecting. A bid Leo had initially called a waste of time. Each building was a silent monument to my sacrifice, invisible to everyone but me. They were the silent screams of a life I had traded for theirs. And tonight, I was driving to the celebration of my own erasure. The moment I stepped into the grand ballroom, the difference was palpable. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the low murmur of self-congratulation. I was an island of muted, practical navy in a glittering sea of my family's designer clothes. My mother, Margaret, was holding court near the entrance, a vision in champagne silk, her laughter tinkling like the expensive bracelets on her wrist. My younger brother, Leo, stood beside her, looking every bit the part of the young, visionary leader he was pretending to be. He caught my eye and gestured me over, a king summoning a courtier. "Ellie, there you are," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. He turned to the man beside him, a city councilman with a vested interest in our company's success. "Councilman, oh, I'd like you to meet my sister, Eleanor. She's a tremendous help with all the back office things that keep the lights on." The councilman gave me a polite, dismissive nod before turning his attention back to Leo, already deep in a conversation about zoning permits, a tremendous help. The words hung in the air, a perfectly crafted insult wrapped in a compliment. I wasn't a partner, or a leader, or the acting CEO. I was a help, the human equivalent of a sturdy filing cabinet. My mother finally noticed me, her eyes doing a quick, critical scan of my attire. "Oh, Eleanor, dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness as she straightened a non-existent crease on my shoulder. "That blazer is so very practical. You must let me take you shopping sometime. It's important for the family to present a united, successful front." She then turned her attention to a loose thread on Leo's lapel, fussing over it as if it were a matter of national importance, while I stood there, completely invisible once more. I excused myself and found our designated table, table number 1, a place of honor I had paid for but did not feel I belonged at. For a decade. I had been the chief executive officer in everything but name, yet to my family, I was still the glorified personal assistant, the sensible, serious daughter who handled the unpleasantries. This dynamic wasn't new. It had been calcified over years of silent sacrifice on my part and cheerful ignorance on theirs. I remembered the week after my father's funeral with painful clarity. The house was full of wilting flower arrangements and the hushed, awkward whispers of visitors. My mother had taken to her bed, overcome with a grief that rendered her helpless. Leo was busy accepting condolences and acting the part of the bereaved son, but he had no idea where the company's financial records were even kept. It was I who had found the shoebox hidden in the back of my father's closet, overflowing with unpaid invoices and threatening letters from creditors. It was I who had spent that long, terrible night at the dining room table, a calculator and a pot of black coffee my only companions, discovering that Harris Construction was not just struggling, it was technically insolvent, weeks away from total collapse. I remembered standing in the sterile, antiseptic-smelling hallway of the hospital just a month before that, my own future clutched in my hands, a thick envelope containing an acceptance letter to the architecture program I dreamed of since I was a child, a full scholarship. But in the room behind me, my father, his voice a papery whisper, had made me promise. "Your mother sees the world as a stage, and your brother only knows how to play the part," he'd said, his hand frail in mine. "But you're the builder, Ellie. You have the blueprints in your soul. Don't let them tear this down." So I had stayed. I deferred my dream for 1 year, then another, until the deferrals ran out and the dream itself became a ghost, a faded blueprint in a forgotten drawer. As my mother and a brother posed for the cameras, my mind wasn't just on the banquet's cost, it was replaying the highlight reel of my lost decade. I saw the ghosts of sleepless nights, the tense meetings, the payrolls I had personally guaranteed. I remembered a specific board meeting 5 years ago. I had developed a radical plan to diversify our portfolio into sustainable, green building projects. I spent 6 months on the research. The night before the presentation, Leo saw the proposal on my desk, asked a few cursory questions, and the next day, he presented it to the board as his own idea. My mother had beamed, proclaiming him a genius. I had said nothing. A hand touched my shoulder, and I looked up into the kind, weathered face of Jim, our company's first ever foreman. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I was down at the waterfront yesterday. Saw the new library. Your father. He always wanted to build something for the city that would last. You did it. That was all you." His eyes, full of a wisdom my family willfully ignored, held a look of profound understanding. That quiet validation was a lifeline in an ocean of deceit. The lights dimmed. A corporate video began to play, a slick production showcasing the company's decade of growth. It featured Leo in a clean hard hat, pointing decisively at blueprints, while I appeared for a split second, a blurry figure in the background of an office shot. Then, the presenter walked onto the stage. My stomach tightened. The category was Family Business of the Year. I felt a foolish flicker of hope. The presenter's voice boomed, and the award goes to Harris Construction. A polite but enthusiastic wave of applause filled the ballroom. Margaret and Leo rose gracefully, their faces illuminated by the spotlight. I remained seated, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, a fixed smile plastered on my face while my heart hammered against my ribs. My mother reached the podium. She began her speech, thanking her late husband for his founding vision of vision. I recalled. That was about building quality, affordable homes, not the high-stakes commercial developments I had pushed for to save us from ruin. Her eyes scanned the room, and for a fraction of a second, they landed on me with the same polite indifference she would give the waitstaff. Then she turned her radiant smile upon my brother. and I am so incredibly proud of my son. Leo, she continued, her voice swelling with pride, for his brilliant leadership, his modern approach, and for bravely carrying the torch of his father's legacy into the future. When she praised his leadership, my mind flashed to a supplier strike 2 years ago that threatened to derail our biggest project. Leo was on a ski trip in Aspen. His phone turned off. I had spent 72 straight hours in negotiations, living off stale coffee, until I'd brokered a deal that saved the company millions. Leo had returned and called it good teamwork. Then came the final, killing stroke. Margaret placed a hand on Leo's arm, her voice softening. "We are just so blessed to have Leo leading the charge," she said, while my daughter, Eleanor, has always been happy to support them from the background. I guess some people are born to be leaders, and others are born to help. The room erupted in applause. The sound was deafening, my wine tasted like metal, and the air grew thick. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I folded my napkin, placed it neatly on the table, and stood up. I pushed my chair in with a soft, definitive thud, and without looking at anyone, I turned and walked out. The entire walk. I could feel their stares on my back. I passed tables of employees whose jobs I had saved, associates whose trust I had earned. Some looked away, ashamed. Others whispered. But for the first time, I didn't care. The ties had been severed. The cool air of the hotel lobby was a shock to my system. Instead of the main exit, I made a sharp right toward the dimly lit hotel bar. Sitting alone was Marcus Carlin, the founder of our company's biggest rival. As I approached, he looked up, his eyes holding not pity, but a sharp intelligence. "Eleanor," he said, gesturing to the empty chair. "That was quite the speech. They've always been good at telling stories," I replied, my voice surprisingly steady. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "Stories don't pay the bills. I put in a bid for the waterfront contract 2 years ago. We were underbid by a razor-thin margin. I ran the numbers for weeks and never understood how Harris Construction made it work without taking a loss. That was you, wasn't it?" I just nodded. "My standing offer to acquire your company is still on the table," he said, his voice even. "It's a serious one. Perhaps now you'll find the time to consider it." I turned and walked away, his words echoing in my mind, no longer just a seed, but a rapidly growing root system of resolve. The drive home was silent. My mind was eerily calm, a cold clarity where 10 years of suppressed anger were finally crystallizing into a single, hard point of purpose. I drove to my Aunt Carol's house. She opened the door, her face a mask of pity. "Oh, Eleanor, you shouldn't have run off. You know how your mother gets. You just have to learn to let Leo have his moment." I walked past her without a word and went to the guest room. Sleep was impossible. Around midnight, I heard voices from the kitchen. I just don't know what her problem is. Margaret sighed. "She has to make everything about her." My Aunt Carol added, "She was always such a serious child. Carol never knew how to have fun. Some people are just ungrateful." I stood in the shadows, my hand gripping the door frame. They weren't sorry. They were annoyed. The next morning, Leo's social media post was the final assault for the next 48 hours. I was a ghost. Then, I called my lawyer. "Sarah, it's time," I said. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I drove to my office. It felt like a pilgrimage as I walked through the silent halls, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. I ran my hand over the architectural models of buildings I had designed, my fingers tracing the lines of a future I had built for others. On the wall was a photo of the original crew, my father in the center, a younger Jim beside him, all of them proud and covered in sawdust. I was going to sell this company, not just as an act of revenge, but as an act of painful, necessary liberation. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my father's heavy oak desk and pulled out the faded manila folder. Sarah's office was bright and modern. She read the document, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to righteous anger. "Ellie, this is ironclad," she said, looking up at me. This isn't just a piece of paper. This is a corporate scepter. Your father didn't just ask you to help, he gave you the kingdom. It's time to put on the crown, even if it's just to burn the castle down. On Monday morning, at precisely 9 o'clock, the email was sent, the subject line official notice regarding the acquisition of Harris Construction. My phone immediately began to detonate. Leo's texts were a stream of pure rage. My mother's voicemails were a masterclass in emotional manipulation. That afternoon, there was a furious banging on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole to see Leo's enraged, blotchy face. He yelled my name, demanding I open the door, telling me I was destroying everything. I simply watched, my heart beating calmly, until he finally gave up and stormed away. I did not open the door. To my brother's final, frantic text, I attached the PDF of the agreement. Then I typed 3 words, "Read the fine print." I then put my phone on silent. A profound, unbelievable peace settled over me. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal maneuvers. The family's expensive lawyers sent threatening letters. Sarah and her team dismantled their arguments with calm, surgical precision. They tried to convene an emergency board meeting, only for Sarah to remind them that my position was absolute. They were trapped. Their pride would not allow them to publicly admit the truth. One evening, before leaving the office for the last time, I was packing a small box of my things, my father's old drafting tools. A handful of books. Jim, the foreman, appeared at my doorway. "We'll miss you, boss," he said, using the title no one else would. "You did right by your dad. You built this place right." That was the only goodbye I needed. My mother made one last, desperate call. "What do you want?" "Eleanor," she pleaded. "A title. We can make you president. Just call this off." I stood by my apartment window, looking down at the city lights, at the buildings I had built. I already had a title. "Mom," I said softly, "the only one that mattered, and I'm done with it now. Goodbye." I ended the call. 6 months later, I was sitting in a sunny piazza in Florence. The air smelled of espresso and old stone. My life was blissfully, beautifully quiet. In my first weeks here, there had been moments of profound loneliness, the terrifying silence of a life completely unmoored from its past. But slowly, painstakingly, I had built a new foundation. I made clumsy conversation in Italian with the woman who ran the bakery down the street. I enrolled in an art history course at the local university. I filled sketchbooks with the details of ancient doorways and archways. I was no longer fixing a broken company. I was rediscovering the architect I was always meant to be. A postcard was waiting for me at my small hotel. The picture was of my hometown's skyline. The handwriting on the back was my mother's. A single, tear-stained sentence. "We were wrong." I stared at it for a long moment, thinking of all the words that weren't there. "I'm sorry. I love you. We miss you." The 2 words were an admission of fact, not an apology of the heart. It was the last, weakest move in a game I was no longer playing. I slipped the postcard between the pages of my architecture book, its message already a relic from a life that was no longer mine. And then I turned the page,